Welcome everyone to part one of Urban Landscapes of Racial Identity in Post-War America, from Chicago to Little Rock, 1945 to 1957. We'll do a video lecture here, the first part of this PowerPoint lecture, and the second half, or second part, will then correspond to the chapter you're assigned from American Realities, and that would be chapter 12. Chicago's blues and the assertion of black identity. We begin here with America during World War II, and what sometimes historians will refer to as the Great Migration. This refers not to a transfer of people from foreign countries to the United States, but an internal migration from the South to the North, from the sharecrop farms of the U.S. South, the African American sharecrop farmers and their families migrating northward from the South to the industrial cities, cities like Chicago and Detroit and Gary, Indiana, Pittsburgh. These are the war towns and the industrial towns that will now attract growing numbers, both in World War I and World War II, I should say, growing numbers of internal migrants, mostly African American families, rural folk, as I say. Between 1940 and 1950, 1.5 million black people migrated northward from the cottonlands and rural districts of the South. And by the end of World War II, the black population of America was more urban than rural. So a great demographic shift in this country. For the first time, something like a majority of black people living in cities and growing numbers of them living outside the South in northern cities. And then we could include also in the far west, in California, in Los Angeles in particular, and even in Northern California, growing African American population attracted by wartime job opportunities. Adding to the growing communities of urban black culture and life now are these new arrivals that included the south side of Chicago, famous Bronzeville, which will become during the war years a bustling neighborhood of African American, mostly southern rural migrant folk from the Delta, many of them, the Mississippi Delta, the plantation lands, the cotton lands of the Delta, right to the Windy City. You can tell by the photographs here that more was going on than a simple distance to travel, something like a world left behind and a new world entered. Robert Petway here and Tommy McLennan here were good friends back in Greenwood, Mississippi. Both had been recruited by a talent scout for a record company, Lester Melrose, to record for his Bluebird record label, and that was in 1939. You see the picture of them down here. Tommy McClellan is the third man from the left. Having arrived in Chicago, the style of dress, the manners, the rhythm of life, the pulse of the city will have an enormous effect on the very appearance of these men and women who make the journey northward. That transition from the sharecrop farms and the poverty and even racial violence of the Deep South, now to the teeming tenement apartments of towns like Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, Bronzeville. One of my favorite pictures from American history suggests the ways in which this migration affects a cultural transformation, a transformation of identity, as new identities emerge from the urban cultures now of the North. These young men are really decked out, in their best urban wear, you might say, coats and jackets and laced shoes and argyle socks and ties and hats wide brimmed, fedora hats, sitting on the front end of this car. The grill itself bespeaks something of an urban automobile. Gwendolyn Brooks, a poet from Chicago, one of America's great 20th century poets, writes of this new urban culture, and particularly the masculine identities that begin to form in this urban climb. Her poem here called "We Real Cool," the pool player, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. So much in this poem suggesting the new identities of African American men, in particular, the late night urban culture, the pool halls, the nightclubs. There's something almost tragic at the same time as something edgy and exciting. We die soon. Spoke to the real dangers of urban life. If in the Jim Crow South, there was the lynch rope or the Klan, the menace of racial violence, there was a different kind of violence in the North. We sing sin, she writes. Remember, there's two broad categories of African American popular music. One would be the spiritual gospel song that comes out of the black church. The other is the tradition of the blues, the secular music, and often seen as the devil's music, the counterpart to the spiritual music. And the blues will follow these migrants up the rail lines, up the Highway 61 that travels up along the Mississippi River. And music is a fundamental part of this new urban identity and expression. Many of the men who were part of the original Delta blues scene in Mississippi will now find their way to the industrial jobs of the North during World War II, giving rise to a new kind of blues, from rural to urban, country to city, acoustic to electric. Not only was the music amplified, the blues band now completed the package with bass guitar, drums, piano, and sometimes horns. I'm going to post a couple of YouTube videos for you to watch to get a sense of this new urban style of blues music that will be so influential on our popular culture. Artists like John Lee Hooker, born Clarksdale, Mississippi in 1917, traveled to the northern cities, first to Detroit, where he worked in the Ford plant during the war, and then to Chicago. He had learned to play the guitar back in the Delta, but learned to play the electric guitar now in the North, and found gigs in bars and nightclubs, both in Detroit and Chicago. Become one of the great urban blues artists of the 20th century, as was Muddy Waters. Muddy Waters, born McKinley Morganfield in 1914, or sometime around 1914. He gave different dates, and it's still an open question exactly when he was born in Issaquena County, Mississippi, where he learned to play the Delta blues, just like John Lee Hooker on a acoustic guitar. And it was playing an acoustic guitar that saw him recorded in 1941. Alan Lomax, who was doing his tour through the South on behalf of the Smithsonian Institution, recording folk music, but music played by ordinary folk. He combed the Delta Basin and even the prisons of the Deep South, looking for guitar pickers and singers. when he was told about this fellow that called himself Muddy Waters, he made his way out to the plantation where Muddy worked and lived as a sharecropper. Lomax paid him $20 to sing a couple songs into his recording machine, and was so impressed by what he heard that he encouraged Muddy Waters to move north, to go to Chicago. Gave him a couple of names of folks that he could contact, and he did. By 1943, he was in Chicago, got a job as a truck driver, working in a factory, began playing electric guitar. His great urban blues tune, "I'm Ready," I'll post for you, and you get a sense of, again, the emerging identities. This is something that bears a little commentary here. When you listen to this music, you'll hear the musical differences, particularly with the Delta blues, the acoustic Delta blues. As I say, it's amplified, it's up tempo, it's a band sound now. Muddy Waters will form his own band, and yet there's more than that. It's an assertiveness, a swagger. It's sometimes what we call the birth of cool, as we saw in the Gwendolyn Brooks poem, a new look, a new identity. And this was extraordinarily important because recall that in the Jim Crow South, the boundaries were so tightly drawn that to be black and to be a man in particular was to live in a world of rather narrow boundaries. In the Gone with the Wind image of the South, in the white imagination of the Jim Crow South, black men were either subservient, almost overgrown children, really, or they were molesters, marauders, rapists. The standard excuse given by every lynch mob, for the lynching of a black man was that he had raped or assaulted or talked fresh to a white woman, and that taboo, that to be a black man and have any sexuality, any masculine identity of that sort was to risk, the wrath of the lynch mob. So this blues music, it's often very very earthy, urban, sexual, edgy, and boastful. There's a lot of sort of bragging, about sexual prowess. How much one could drink, how much one could shoot pool, how much sex one might demonstrate. Some sort of unconquerable appetite. And this finds greater expression now in the North than it could have possibly in the South. Another famous bluesman who will make the tour from the Delta to the North, of course, was B.B. King, born in 1925 near Itabena, Mississippi. Got a job working on a plantation, heard about an opportunity to record music, went up to Memphis, where he played in the blues joints on Beale Street in Memphis. And later to the north, to again cities like Chicago, where he established his reputation as a great bluesman. In the 1960s, he recorded B.B. King live in the Cook County Jail in Chicago, an absolutely riveting performance in front of the inmate population. Just as Johnny Cash had done at Folsom and San Quentin, B.B. King did a prison concert. When not performing for inmates, though, you would hear the blues and the bluesmen in the nightclubs of Chicago's South Side, like the 1815 Club, located along West Roosevelt Avenue. In Chicago, this was music now that could be advertised. People would come to hear their favorite musicians, and attracting the notice of promoters, a growing commercial success. Sweet Home Chicago, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Jimmy Reed, Little Walter. These are the great names of the wartime, and post-war blues scene. Tommy McClendon, you see again from the Bluebird label. Aristocrat Records and Chess Records begin to press onto vinyl this new music, and it finds quickly a market. The Delta blues sound would be, of course, just fundamental to so much music of the 20th century, but promoters always understood that somehow that music was niche music. They called it race music, and it filled a niche, a regional appeal, regional market. But now in the North, the recording, and the broadcasting of the radio will greatly expand the boundaries of the market. So again, it's possible to see this transformation from a tightly bounded, traditionally poor black sharecrop South to a more expansive, growing, more freely expressive North. Not that there wasn't the same sort of racial antagonisms in the North we saw in World War II. There were riots, but there was nevertheless a kind of opportunity for a man, because the color of his skin had been so restricted in one place, now finding a certain freedom. And some of these guys, like B.B. King, will do well enough that they'll be able to tour and even go international. They'll travel through concert dates in Europe and visit all the capitals of Europe and really gain an international audience. Interesting part of this story were the Chess brothers. Phil Chess, here you see him with record fans in a South Side record shop. Chess was born Fizzle Chaz, a good Polish name. They were Polish immigrants. He and his family, his brother migrated to America. He began the record label with his brother in the 40s. They owned both the Aristocrat label and the Chess record label, and recorded many of the greats, such as Muddy Waters, Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry. They recorded rock and rollers like Chuck Berry as well, the great blues singer Etta James, and really allowed this music now to find a broader, wider audience. And in the process, creating a terrific cultural legacy for Chicago. The Chicago blues sound became a standard in post-war America for its raw edge, and really hugely influenced the development of rock and roll. Just as we saw with the Delta sound, so too will now the urban blues with its electric guitars and pianos and harmonicas and even occasionally horn sections. Will become part of a wall of sound that defines rock and roll into the 1960s and beyond, and inspires kids here and abroad, particularly in England, where the Keith Richardses and the Eric Claptons and the great English rock and rollers who will be part of that wave of British invasion, beginning with the Beatles in 1964. These kids will cut their teeth on the music of these American bluesmen, and I've probably mentioned it, and you may know, but again, the Rolling Stones, one of the British bands that comes in the 60s, took their name from a Muddy Waters song, like a Rolling Stone. Right on down to the present, with the House of Blues franchise, the Blues Brothers movie. Cadillac Records was a movie made here a few years ago with Beyonce and Adrian Brody. Beyonce playing Etta James, Adrian Brody playing Phil Chess, telling the story of the Chicago blues in the wartime period. So, a terrific cultural legacy and part of a new identity then, new, more assertive, expansive African American identity. There's no doubt that the country was changing. The second half of the lecture, the civil rights landscapes of the South, will start in Montgomery, Alabama, and take us through Little Rock, Arkansas, in the 1950s, what we recognize now as the civil rights movement. But keep in mind, it's really growing out of the war years. The catalyst was World War II for so much of this change, whether it be the migrations that we just talked about, or the sort of growing political interest in civil rights and protest and legal strategies. And that's what you're going to be reading about and hearing about now in part two of this lecture.